Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku became the new Martian Manhunter on Earth. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The smell of burnt sugar and singed paper clung to Izuku Midoriya like a second skin. It was a familiar scent, one that had defined the end of more school days than he cared to count. He knelt by the murky koi pond behind Aldera Junior High, his fingers trembling as he reached into the water. The ripples distorted his reflection, shattering the image of a tear-streaked, defeated boy into 1,000 wobbling pieces. His notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13, was a sodden, ruined mess. The ink had bled across the pages, turning his meticulous drawings and frantic, hopeful notes into abstract, blue-black Rorschach blots. The cover, once a proud declaration of his dream, was blistered and curled at the edges where Katsuki Bakugo's explosive quirk had seared it. "You're pathetic," Bakugo's voice echoed in his mind, sharp and cruel as broken glass. "Still chasing a stupid dream? You're quirkless. Less than a zero. You want to be a hero so bad? I've got a time-saving idea for you. Pray you'll be born with a quirk in your next life, and take a swan dive off the roof of the building." Laughter. The sycophantic, jeering laughter of Bakugo's cronies had followed, chasing him out of the classroom, down the stairs, and all the way here. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, the phantom sound ringing in his ears. He knew Kaken didn't really mean it. It was just Kaken. But the words, once spoken, had a life of their own. They had lodged themselves in his chest, a cold, heavy stone of truth. He was quirkless. In a world where 80% of the population possessed some extraordinary ability, he was a throwback, a relic of a bygone era. His dream of becoming a hero, of saving people with a fearless smile like his idol, All Might, wasn't just improbable. It was a statistical and biological impossibility. Everyone told him so. The doctors, his teachers, his classmates. Even his own mother, in her tearful, apologetic "I'm sorry, Izuku," had confirmed it long ago. He was just a fanboy with a notebook. A deluded Deku, the one who can't do anything. Clutching the pulpy remains of his notebook, he began the long, quiet walk home. He usually took the most direct route, but today his feet felt like lead. The thought of facing his mother's worried gaze, of having to pretend that everything was fine, was too much to bear. He needed a detour. He needed to be alone with the hollow ache in his soul. His path took him towards the coast, towards the Goba Municipal Beach Park. It was a place most people avoided. Once a beautiful shoreline, it had become an illegal dumping ground over the years, a massive, festering wound on the city's edge. Mountains of rusted appliances, broken furniture, and discarded technology choked the sand, their metallic skeletons reaching towards the sky like the forgotten titans of a dead civilization. The air was thick with the smell of brine, rust, and decay. It was a perfect reflection of how he felt. A trash heap of broken dreams. Izuku found a relatively stable pile of old washing machines to sit on, overlooking the gray, churning ocean. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds in bruised shades of orange and purple. He opened the ruined notebook, trying in vain to salvage a single page. A drawing of the new hero, Empty Lady, was now a formless blue smudge. His detailed analysis of Kamui Wood's lacquered chain prison was illegible. All those hours of observation, of dedication, of hope, reduced to pulp. A fresh wave of despair washed over him, so potent it made him physically nauseous. Maybe Kaken was right. Maybe it was all useless. What was the point of analyzing quirks he could never have? What was the point of dreaming a dream he could never reach? For the first time in his 14 years of life, the bright, indomitable flame of hope that had always burned within him flickered, threatening to be extinguished entirely. He sat there for what could have been minutes or an hour, lost in the rhythmic crash of the waves against the shore and the vastness of his own misery. The sky deepened to a velvety indigo, pricked with the first faint stars. It was then that he saw it, a falling star. But it was wrong. It wasn't the quick, silvery streak he was used to. This was a deliberate, almost sluggish descent, a point of emerald green light that grew steadily larger, leaving a faint, shimmering trail in its wake. It wasn't burning up, it was falling. And it was falling here. He watched, mesmerized, as it descended behind a particularly large mountain of junk on the far side of the beach. There was no thunderous explosion, no blinding flash of light, just a deep, resonant thump that he felt more in his bones than heard with his ears, followed by the screech and groan of tortured metal. Then silence. Every rational thought in his head screamed at him to run. It could be a piece of a satellite, toxic and radioactive. It could be a villain's weapon. It could be anything dangerous and unpredictable. But another part of him, the part that still foolishly dreamed of heroics, that ran towards danger instead of away from it, was already moving. His legs, which had felt so heavy just moments before, were carrying him across the treacherous landscape of trash. He stumbled over discarded tires, slid down slopes of scrap metal, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was reckless. It was stupid. It was the most alive he had felt all day. The source of the impact was in a small, self-made canyon of debris, walled in by towering stacks of crushed cars and rusted shipping containers. The air here was different. It hummed with a strange, static energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. And there, half buried in the sand and twisted metal, was the star. It wasn't a meteor. It was a craft of some kind, though unlike any technology he had ever seen. It was small, no bigger than a car, and its shape was both fluid and asymmetrical, as if it had been grown rather than built. The whole was a dark, mottled material that seemed to drink the twilight, shifting between deep green and obsidian black. It was clearly damaged. A large, jagged fissure ran along its side, glowing faintly with a soft, internal luminescence. The entire thing looked ancient and organic, a beetle's carapace fused with a seed pod from an alien world. Izuku approached cautiously, his breath held tight in his chest. He half expected an alarm to blare or a defense system to activate, but there was only the sound of the wind whistling through the junk piles and a faint, almost inaudible, low-pitched hum coming from the craft. He peered into the fissure. The glowing light pulsed weakly from within, illuminating a cockpit that seemed molded for a non-humanoid body. And slumped within that cockpit was a figure. Izuku's blood ran cold. It was a person. An injured pilot. His heroic instincts, however battered, took over completely. "Hello? Are you okay?" he called out, his voice a hoarse whisper. There was no response. He carefully pried at the edges of the fissure, the strange metal unexpectedly pliable under his fingers. It widened enough for him to slip through. The interior of the pod was cramped and smelled of ozone and something else, something strange and earthy, like desert soil after a rainstorm. The light came from vein-like conduits that snaked across the walls, all of them flickering and dying. And then he got a clear look at the occupant. It was not human. The being was tall and slender, its form stretched out unnaturally in the confined space. Its skin was a deep, muted shade of green, like moss in the deep woods. It was humanoid, with 2 arms and 2 legs, but its limbs were longer, its frame more willowy. It wore a simple, dark blue uniform, torn and scorched in several places, with a bold, red X emblazoned across its chest, held together by 2 golden clasps at the shoulders. Its head was high-domed and bald, with a pronounced brow ridge that gave it a stern, thoughtful appearance. But it was the being's eyes that held Izuku captive. They were open, and they were a deep, glowing red. And they were filled with an ancient, fathomless exhaustion. It was grievously wounded. A deep, cauterized gash swept dark, almost black, blood across its torso. Its breathing was shallow, a faint rasp in the quiet pod. Izuku, the boy who had memorized the quirks and costumes of hundreds of heroes, felt a jolt of impossible recognition. He had seen this being before, in grainy, pre-quirk-era conspiracy photos and obscure alien encounter forums online. A myth. A ghost story. The Martian Manhunter. The alien's head turned with an agonizingly slow creak of sinew. Those glowing red eyes focused on Izuku, and for a moment, Izuku was paralyzed by a primal fear. This was it. This was real. An alien. A real, living, no, dying, alien was looking right at him. And then, a voice echoed in his mind. It didn't come through his ears. It bloomed directly in the center of his consciousness, calm, resonant, and unimaginably weary. "Do not be afraid, little one." Izuku flinched back, stumbling against the wall of the pod. What? He stammered aloud. I am John Johns. And I am dying. The mental voice was laced with a profound and simple finality. There was no self-pity, only a statement of fact. The alien, John, tried to push himself up, but a spasm of pain racked his body. He slumped back, his breath hitching. Izuku, his fear momentarily forgotten and replaced by a surge of empathy, moved forward instinctively. You're hurt. I have to get help. I'll call an ambulance, a hero. No. The mental command was gentle but firm. It is too late for me. The damage is fundamental. My cellular structure is failing. But your presence here, it is not a coincidence. John's red eyes seemed to look straight through Izuku's skin, past his bones, and into the very core of his being. Izuku felt a strange, tingling sensation in his mind, like a gentle probe. It wasn't invasive or painful, just inquisitive. He felt as though his entire life was being laid bare, not as a series of memories, but as a tapestry of emotion. The voice returned, now tinged with a deep, aching sorrow, but also a flicker of wonder. Such sorrow, such loneliness. They call you useless. They tell you to abandon your dream, and yet you do not. Deep within you, beneath the pain, there is a core of adamant, a selfless, burning desire to protect others, even at great cost to yourself. A heart of a true hero. Izuku's eyes welled with tears. To be seen, to be truly seen, like this by a dying alien in a crashed spaceship was more validating than anything anyone had ever said to him in his entire life. He couldn't speak, he could only nod, a choked sob escaping his throat. John's expression softened. I have been the sole survivor of my kind for a very long time. I have carried the memory of my people, my world, my family, alone. Mars is dead. A great fire, a psychic plague unleashed by our enemies, consumed us all. I came to this world, your world, and found a home. I tried to protect it. But the fire followed me. Flashes of images, unsolicited, bloomed in Izuku's mind. A vibrant red desert under two moons. Towering, elegant cities of white stone. Green-skinned people laughing, their minds linked in a great, peaceful chorus. Then fire. Screams that were not sound but pure psychic agony. White, monstrous figures with red eyes, shifting and tearing and killing. The faces of a green-skinned woman and a small child, twisted in terror, dissolving into flame. The psychic feedback was so intense Izuku cried out, clutching his head. Stop! It hurts. Forgive me, John's voice soothed, the horrifying images receding. That is the grief I carry. The fight that has consumed my life. I have just finished my last battle. A vanguard of my ancient enemy, the White Martians, has already begun to seed itself on your world. I stopped them, for now. But it cost me the last of my strength, my legacy, my people, everything I am, will turn to dust with me. The alien's long, green fingers reached out, not to touch Izuku, but hovering in the air before him. The air in the pod grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of power, but it does not have to. You, who dreams of being a hero but lacks the power. I, who has the power but lacks the time. My fight is over, but yours is just beginning. I can give you my gifts, my strength, my flight, my form. My mind. All of it. It will be a heavy burden. You will carry my sorrows. You will see the world as I do. You will no longer be entirely human, but you will have the power to live your dream. The power to save everyone. Izuku stared, his mind reeling. This was impossible. This was a dream. A hallucination brought on by grief and a bump to the head. But the weight in the air, the voice in his skull, the dying god before him, it was all terrifyingly real. It was everything he had ever wanted, offered to him in the most frightening way imaginable. Why me? Izuku finally whispered, the words small and fragile. Because you have a good heart, John replied simply. Power does not make a hero. The will to use it for others does. I see that will in you. It is the best of my people, and the best of yours. This is not an easy gift. It is an inheritance. A legacy. My life's purpose can live on through you. Will you accept? There was no time to think. No time to weigh the pros and cons. There was only the image of Bakugo's sneering face, the memory of his mother's tears, the feeling of utter powerlessness that had been his constant companion. And then there was the alternative. The chance to be more. The chance to save people. The chance to make his dream a reality. With tears streaming down his face, Izuku Midoriya gave a single, determined nod. Yes. A faint, sad smile touched the Martian's lips. His hand moved forward, and two of his fingers gently pressed against Izuku's forehead. Then be the best of us. The world exploded. It was not a sound or a light, but a total dissolution of self. Izuku's consciousness was ripped from its moorings and thrown into a hurricane of thought, memory, and raw sensation. His own 14 years of life were a tiny, flickering candle flame swallowed by a supernova. He was Izuku Midoriya, son of Inko, a quirkless boy from Muzurifu. He was John's, husband to Mirai, father to Khyam, a manhunter from Mars. He felt the cool sands of the Martian desert on his feet and the worn asphalt of his neighborhood street. He tasted his mother's katsudon and the sweet, strange flavor of a Martian eno fruit. He experienced the terror and pain of Ramirez's curse, a psychic fire that had burned a psychosomatic weakness into the very soul of the Martian race, a fear of flames so profound it could tear their bodies apart. He felt the phantom agony of a real fire, too, the heat that had taken his family from him. He felt the crushing, soul-deep loneliness of being the last of his kind, a solitude that spanned centuries, a grief that was a constant, silent ocean within him. He felt the awkward, burgeoning hope of finding a new family in a team of brightly colored heroes on a vibrant blue world. The quiet camaraderie with a grim, black-clad detective, the booming laughter of a god of thunder. The unwavering compassion of an Amazonian princess. The complex, respectful rivalry with a man who dressed like a bat. He learned the intricacies of Martian biology from the inside out. He felt his own human cells being rewritten, his DNA being forcibly resequenced. He understood shape-shifting not as a trick, but as a conscious, voluntary control over every molecule of his body. He felt the potential for density shifting, for invisibility through light refraction, for phasing his very atoms through solid matter. He felt the 9 senses of a Martian, the raw power of Martian vision, the silent, unstoppable strength humming in muscles that were no longer purely human, and the telepathy. Oh God, the telepathy. It was the most overwhelming of all. He wasn't just receiving John's thoughts. He was receiving the concept of thought itself. He felt the minds of his new family, the Justice League, a chorus of powerful, unique consciousnesses. He felt the silent, hateful, hungry minds of the white Martians. He felt the collective unconscious of an entire dead race, a library of souls, all contained within the mind that was now merging with his own. It was too much. The grief was too much. The power was too much. The sheer volume of being was too much. Izuku's mind, his very identity, was fraying at the edges, threatening to tear apart and be lost in the maelstrom of John's millennia-long existence. He was drowning. Then, through the chaos, came John's final, coherent thought. It was not a command, but a shield, a gentle hand guiding him. It was a feeling of peace, of acceptance, of a long and weary journey finally at its end. It is all right. Rest now. You are not alone anymore. The hurricane of sensation began to recede, not vanishing, but integrating, settling into the cracks of his being, filling the hollow spaces he never knew he had. The two consciousnesses, the boy and the god, began to merge, to braid themselves together into something new. Izuku felt the pressure on his forehead disappear. He opened his eyes, though he hadn't realized he'd closed them. The Martian Manhunter was gone. In his place, a pile of fine, greenish-brown dust lay on the floor of the cockpit, shimmering faintly before dissolving into nothing. A single, red X emblem, crafted from some unknown metal, lay glinting on top of the dust. John's, the last green Martian, had given everything he was, and in the end, had simply ceased to be. The transfer was complete. Izuku stood there, shaking, in the silent pod. He was still Izuku. He had his own memories, his own face. But he was also more. He felt the echo of John's love for his family like a phantom limb. He felt the deep, instinctual fear of a lit match. He could feel the junk of Dagoba Beach not just with his skin, but with a strange, cellular awareness. He could hear the distant, faint murmur of thoughts from the city, a low thrum on the edge of his new senses. His mind was a library where all the books had been thrown on the floor, and someone else's much larger library had been dumped on top. His body felt alien to him, a suit of clothes that was both too big and too small at the same time. The sheer, raw potential humming in every cell was terrifying. The biological and psychic shockwave hit him all at once. His vision swam. The low hum of the city's thoughts became a rising roar. His own human DNA screamed in protest at the Martian template being forced upon it. A wave of nausea and vertigo crashed over him, and the world tilted on its axis. His last coherent thought was a fractured mess, a name that was his and not his, echoing in the vast, new space of his mind. Izuku. John's. Then, the darkness claimed him, and he collapsed onto the floor of the alien pod, a boy no longer, but not yet a man, cradled in the wreckage of a dead world's final hope. Izuku woke to the familiar smell of aged paper and the faint, plasticky scent of his all-might action figures. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed through his window, casting a warm, rectangular patch on his comforter. For a blissful, silent moment, everything was normal. His body felt heavy with sleep, and a dull, persistent thrumming echoed behind his eyes, the ghost of a headache. He blinked, the dream he'd had already fading into surreal, disjointed fragments, a crashing green star. A dying alien. A voice in his head. He groaned, rolling over and burying his face in his pillow. It must have been a stress dream, a particularly vivid one brought on by the events of yesterday. Bakugo, the notebook, the despair. His subconscious had probably cobbled together bits and pieces of his hero obsession and his feelings of powerlessness into some bizarre sci-fi fantasy. It was the only logical explanation. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His feet hit the cool wood floor with a soft thud. He felt hollowed out, as if he'd run a marathon in his sleep. His gaze fell upon the corner of his desk. There, lying in a sad, waterlogged heap, was Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 13. The cover was warped, the pages fused together by pond water and grief. It wasn't a dream. The memory of it rushed back, not as a dream but as a sharp, crystalline reality. The humming pod. The smell of ozone. The kind, weary, red eyes of John Johns. The gentle pressure of 2 fingers on his forehead, and then, the explosion. The hurricane of memories, of a life lived for millennia on a world of red sand. Izuku's breath hitched. He scrambled over to his desk, his hands shaking as he picked up the ruined notebook. It was real. He had been there. He had walked home from Dagoba Beach in a daze, the details of the journey a complete blank, his body operating on some numb, shell-shocked autopilot. He'd stumbled into his room and collapsed into bed, the weight of 2 lives too much for one boy's mind to bear. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, 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 it can't be. Oh, my poor boy. He had such a terrible day yesterday. I hope he's feeling better this morning. He looked so pale when he came in. Maybe I should make katsudon for breakfast, his favorite. Yes, that will cheer him up. Let's see, do we have enough pork? And breadcrumbs. Izuku froze, his hand clamped over his mouth. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a thought. A clear, distinct, worried stream of consciousness that was not his own. It was the gentle, loving cadence of his mother. And it was coming from the kitchen. He stumbled back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Mom? He whispered, his voice trembling. The thoughts continued, oblivious to his psychic eavesdropping. Definitely need more breadcrumbs. And maybe I should pick up some of that new brand of miso he likes. Oh, but I have to remember the parent-teacher meeting forms are due today. This was impossible. He was imagining it. He had to be. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eyes, trying to block it out, to force the world back to normal. But the world was getting louder. As his panic mounted, it was as if a dial was being turned in his head. The single, clear stream of his mother's thoughts was joined by another. Ugh, this route again. Mrs. Tanaka's dog always tries to bite my ankles. Just smile and deliver the mail. Just smile and deliver the mail. the mailman. Down the street. If I don't pass this calculus exam, my parents are going to kill me. Focus, Haruto, focus. What is the derivative of x squared again? A high schooler in the house across the way, cramming for a test. Sunbeam. Warm. Good. Sleep now. The neighbor's cat, sunning itself on a windowsill. More and more voices flooded in, a rising tide of consciousness. It was a cacophony, 1,000 radios all tuned to different stations, playing simultaneously inside his skull. The mundane anxieties of his neighbors, the snippets of songs stuck in strangers' heads, the raw, unfiltered emotions of every living mind within a block, then 2 blocks, then the whole neighborhood. It was a symphony of chaos, and Izuku was its unwilling conductor. The thrumming behind his eyes intensified into a piercing, white-hot agony. It was a sensory overload of the most profound and intimate kind. He wasn't just hearing noise. He was experiencing the private, internal lives of dozens, hundreds of people at once. Their worries, their joys, their grocery lists, their secret shames, their half-forgotten memories. It was an unbearable violation, a weight of shared humanity too heavy to carry. He staggered back to his bed, collapsing onto it and curling into a ball. He clapped his hands over his ears, a useless, reflexive gesture. The whispers weren't outside. They were inside. There was no escape. He was a radio receiver with no off switch, tuned to the frequency of every soul around him. Through the psychic maelstrom, he felt a deeper, more profound change. A strange humming sensation under his skin, a low-level vibration in his very cells. He felt mutable, pliable. He pushed himself off the bed and stumbled towards the full-length mirror hanging on his closet door, desperate for a glimpse of normalcy, for proof that he was still himself. The reflection that stared back was his own, yet terrifyingly alien. It was Izuku Midoriya, with his wild bush of green-black hair, his wide, frightened eyes, and his constellation of freckles. But he looked thin, stretched, as if the boy in the mirror was a costume and something else, something larger, was wearing it. He could feel the potential rippling just beneath the surface, the alien biology John had gifted him, coiled and waiting. He felt an intense, sudden desire for the All Might Silver Age Special Edition figure on the top shelf of his bookcase. It was just out of his normal reach. He usually had to grab his little stepstool to get it. He reached up, his fingers straining, his mind singularly focused on the figurine. I just need to reach it, and his arm obeyed. There was no sound, no snap of bone or tear of muscle. His arm simply elongated. His skin, muscle, and bone stretched like warm taffy, his limb extending an impossible 2 feet, his fingers easily wrapping around the cool plastic of the figurine. Izuku stared, his mind going completely blank with shock. He looked from his hand, now holding the All Might figure, back to his shoulder. His arm was a long, thin, cartoonishly stretched appendage of pale green flesh. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so utterly contrary to every law of biology he knew, that his brain simply refused to process it for a second. Then the panic hit him like a physical blow. He shrieked, a high, strangled sound, and tried to pull his arm back. It retracted instantly, snapping back into its normal proportions with a strange, soundless, elastic recoil. He clutched his arm, feeling it. It was solid. Normal. But he knew. He knew what it had just done. He scrambled backwards, away from the terrifying evidence of his own body. He tripped over a pile of textbooks, his arms flailing. He threw a hand out to catch himself against his wooden desk, bracing for the solid impact. His hand met no resistance. He watched in abject horror as his fingers, hand, and wrist became translucent, shimmering with a faint greenish light, and sank directly into the solid oak of his desk as if it were water. There was no pain, only a bizarre, tingling numbness, a cold, static-filled nothingness where the wood should have been. He could see the faint outline of the wood grain through his own shimmering flesh. This time, he didn't even have the breath to scream. He yanked his hand back with a gasp. It solidified instantly, the strange, cold sensation vanishing. He stared at his perfectly normal, perfectly solid hand, then at the perfectly normal, perfectly solid desk. The evidence of the violation was gone, but the memory of it was seared into his brain. It was real. All of it. The dying god, the inheritance, the powers. He was a monster. A freak. He had an alien's power coursing through his veins, a power he couldn't control, a power that was tearing his reality apart. The telepathic whispers swelled again, feeding on his terror, growing louder and more insistent. He couldn't stay here. He had to get out. He had to get away from the thoughts of his mother in the kitchen, away from the minds pressing in on him from all sides. He needed air. He needed space. Moving with a frantic, desperate energy, he threw on a hoodie, pulling the hood up to shadow his face. He fumbled with his sneakers, his fingers feeling clumsy and foreign. Every rustle of his clothes, every beat of his own frantic heart, was amplified, drowned out by the ceaseless, invasive chatter in his head. He had to find a way to make it stop. Quiet. The word was not one of the whispers. It was different. It was deep, calm, and resonant. It was the voice from the pod. John's voice. But it wasn't coming from outside him. It was coming from a deep, still center within himself. An echo. A memory with a will of its own. The mind is a fortress. You must build your walls. Izuku paused, his hand on his doorknob, his breathing ragged. He didn't understand. How could he build walls against something that was already inside him? Focus. Picture a space. A quiet room. Empty. Safe. This is your mind. The whispers are outside that room. Let them knock. Do not let them in. It was a memory of a lesson, a Martian meditation technique learned over centuries of practice, now bubbling up into Izuku's consciousness as a guiding instinct. He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the cool wood of his bedroom door. He tried to picture it, a simple, empty room with 4 blank walls and a single door. He imagined himself inside it, safe and alone. He visualized the cacophony of thoughts as a storm raging outside, their psychic fingers scratching at the door, rattling the windows. It was impossibly difficult. The storm was a hurricane, and his walls were made of paper. But for a fleeting moment, he felt a change. The roar of 100 minds diminished, just slightly. The sharp, individual voices blurred into a dull, manageable drone, like the sound of a distant highway. It wasn't silence, but it was a reprieve. The piercing agony in his skull subsided to a low, throbbing ache. He could breathe again. Taking a shaky breath, he opened his eyes. He could still feel the thoughts out there, a sea of consciousness lapping against the fragile shores of his mental sanctuary. But he wasn't drowning anymore. He was on an island, however small. He slipped out of his room, mumbling a quick, going for a walk. To his mother in the kitchen, avoiding her gaze. He couldn't risk looking at her, couldn't risk her worried thoughts breaching his flimsy new defenses. He needed to walk. He needed to be somewhere he could think. The outside world was a fresh assault. Every person he passed was a walking, talking radio broadcast. A salaryman rushing for his train, his mind a frantic checklist of meeting prep and spilled coffee anxiety. A pair of teenage girls, their thoughts a dizzying mix of gossip about a boy, excitement for a new movie, and insecurity about their outfits. The sheer, overwhelming humanity of it all was staggering. He kept his head down, his hood pulled low, focusing on the image of his quiet room, reinforcing its walls with every step. He walked without a destination, his feet carrying him through familiar streets that now felt alien and hostile. He was so lost in the struggle to maintain his mental quiet that he didn't pay attention to where he was going, turning a corner and nearly colliding with a group of boys in his school uniform. "Whoa, watch it, nerd!" Izuku's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. He looked up, his eyes widening in fear. It was Bakugo, flanked by his 2 usual cronies. They were standing outside a convenience store, loitering with the casual arrogance of predators on their own turf. "Well, well," Bakugo sneered, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "If it isn't the useless Deku. Still look like you're about to cry? Or did you finally take my advice and go for a swim?" His friend snickered. Normally Izuku would have flinched, stammered an apology, and tried to make himself as small as possible. He would have been consumed by fear and humiliation. But today was different. As Bakugo spoke, Izuku felt his thoughts, sharp, angry, and layered. The surface thought was easy to read, loud and clear, projected like a broadcast. "God, he's so pathetic. Just looking at him pisses me off. Always in the way, with those stupid, wide eyes. Why won't he just give up? It was exactly what Izuku would have expected. But beneath that initial wave of contempt, his newfound sense picked up something else. A deeper current, quieter and more complex. It was a tangled knot of insecurity, frustration, and a strange, twisted sort of fear. The thought wasn't in words, but in feelings, in images. A flash of them as children, playing heroes. A flicker of all might on a television screen, a symbol of victory they both looked up to. And then, a dark, churning emotion that felt like dread. A deep-seated, irrational fear that Izuku, the quirkless, useless Deku, would somehow, impossibly, leave him behind. Why does he keep getting back up? Why doesn't he ever just stay down? He looks at me, not with fear anymore. What is that? It's like he sees right through me. What if he's not as useless as he looks? No. Shut up. That's impossible. I'm the one who's going to be number one. I have to be. Izuku stared, his own fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering shock. Kaken was afraid. Not of him, not really. But afraid of the idea of him. Afraid of failure. Afraid of not being the strongest. The explosive arrogance, the constant bullying, the cruel taunts. They weren't just signs of his strength, they were a desperate, constant reinforcement of it. A defense mechanism built to shore up a terrifyingly fragile ego. Bakugo seemed to sense the shift in Izuku's demeanor. The usual terror in Deku's eyes was gone, replaced by something he couldn't decipher. Confusion? Pity? What are you staring at, you damn nerd? Bakugo growled, his hands starting to spark with tiny explosions, his own insecurity manifesting as aggression. For the first time in a decade, Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't cower. The new perspective was too disorienting. He saw not just the bully, but the scared child behind the sneer. It didn't excuse a single cruel word, not a single burn mark on his uniform. But it changed everything. The monster under his bed had been revealed to be just a frightened boy, terrified of the dark. Izuku simply shook his head, a silent, bewildered gesture, and walked past them. He didn't run. He just walked away, leaving Bakugo and his friends momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer, unprecedented lack of a reaction. He didn't stop walking until he was several blocks away, his mind reeling. He ducked into a quiet alleyway, leaning against the cool brick of a wall, his legs feeling weak. The encounter had pierced his mental shields, not with its volume, but with its clarity. He had seen into his tormentor's soul, and the revelation was more destabilizing than any of his new physical abilities. The world was no longer black and white. It was a universe of infinite, gray, messy complexity, and he now had a front-row seat to all of it. The drone of the city's thoughts began to creep back in, his concentration shattered. The headache returned with a vengeance. He slid down the wall, curling into himself, the weight of it all pressing down, the grief of a dead race. The loneliness of a dying god. The burden of 1,000 whispered secrets. The terrifying potential of his own flesh. It was too much. He couldn't do this. He was just Izuku Midoriya. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a Martian. He was a scared, quirkless boy who was losing his mind. You are not losing your mind. You are finding it. John's voice echoed in the quiet of his mental sanctuary. This time it was stronger, clearer. It felt less like an echo and more like a part of his own subconscious, a deeper, wiser self he never knew he had. This is the burden. But it is also the gift. To understand. To truly see others. This is the first step. Control will come. You are not just Izuku Midoriya. You are not just John Johns. You are both, and you are not alone. A strange sense of calm, ancient and profound, began to settle over him. It was John's peace, John's discipline, a legacy of 1 billion years of Martian evolution now hardwired into his brain. He felt the guiding presence showing him, not telling him, how to reinforce his mental shields. Not a simple room, but a fortress. He could feel the mental architecture taking shape, learning to build gates, filters, to consciously lower the volume, to focus on one thought stream at a time, or to push them all away into a distant hum. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and for the first time since he'd woken up, the world went quiet. Not silent. He was still aware of the sea of minds around him, but it was muted, distant, no longer a crashing wave but a gentle tide at the edge of his perception. He was in control. For now. Izuku stayed in that alley for a long time, sitting against the cold brick as the sun began to set. He was Izuku Midoriya, a boy who had inherited a god's power and a ghost's grief. His world had been turned inside out. He was something new, something that had never existed before, a hybrid of human hope and Martian memory. He looked at his hands. They were just his hands. Freckled, a bit calloused. But he knew they could stretch, phase, and reshape into anything he could imagine. He was a weapon. A key. A monster. A hero. The path forward was terrifying and unknown. But as he sat there, in the quiet aftermath of the storm, one thing became clear. His old dream, the simple, childish dream of being a hero like All Might, was dead. In its place was a new reality, a new purpose, forged in the heart of a falling star. His fight was just beginning. And he was terrified. The days that followed were a tightrope walk over a chasm of sensory overload. Izuku learned to live inside the quiet fortress of his own mind, the echo of John's consciousness a silent, steadying sentinel. The world outside the fortress was a constant, low hum, the collective unconscious of Muzurifu, which he learned to filter and mostly ignore. He moved through his life like a ghost, his physical presence a pale imitation of the roiling, alien power he kept carefully contained within. School was a special kind of torment. The dense concentration of minds, anxious, bored, cruel, and curious, was a constant pressure against his mental shields. He could feel the residual fear and confusion emanating from Bakugo whenever he got too close, a psychic static that made the air between them crackle. Bakugo avoided him, his usual taunts replaced by suspicious, narrowed glares. He didn't understand what had happened during their last encounter, but his instincts screamed that Deku was no longer the same predictable, pathetic punching bag. That change, that unknown, was more unsettling to him than any of Izuku's previous quirkless defiance. Izuku spent his afternoons not at home, but at the place where his new life had begun, Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. The relative isolation was a balm to his frayed psychic nerves. The mountains of junk became his training ground, a silent, unjudging witness to his first, clumsy attempts to understand the godlike power thrumming in his veins. Guided by the instinctual memories of John, he began to explore. He would find the most secluded spot, walled in by rusted shipping containers, and let his control slip, just a little. He learned to stretch a limb, watching in a nauseating mix of awe and horror as his arm extended 10, then 20 feet to pluck a bottle cap from a distant pile of rubble. He practiced phasing a single finger through a solid sheet of steel, the cold, static-filled non-space a sensation he doubted he would ever get used to. He tried to levitate, a core Martian ability, but only managed to hover an unsteady inch or two off the ground for a few seconds before crashing back down, his mind unable to grasp the complex physics of density manipulation required for true flight. The power was there. An ocean of it. But he was a child with a thimble, trying to empty it. John's memories provided the textbook, but his own human mind and body had to learn the lessons. It was like having the complete works of Shakespeare downloaded into your brain, but still having to learn to read, write, and speak from scratch. One afternoon, while trying to focus his telepathic senses, he felt a sudden, sharp spike of civic distress. A chorus of panic, sharp and piercing, erupted from a few blocks away. It was followed by the concussive boom of an explosion. Izuku's head snapped up. His heart, his very human heart, began to hammer against his ribs. Smoke was beginning to billow into the sky, a greasy black plume rising from the direction of the Takoba shopping district. Danger! Civilians are in jeopardy, John's voice, now an inseparable part of his own internal monologue, stated with calm urgency. Izuku was already moving. He scrambled over the junk piles, his clumsiness at odds with the frantic speed he felt. He ran towards the smoke, his hero fan instincts, honed over a decade of obsessive analysis, kicking in. He needed to see. He needed to analyze. As he got closer, the psychic noise became a roar. The raw, unfiltered terror of dozens of people was a physical force, pressing against his mental shields. He pushed through a growing crowd of onlookers, their thoughts a chaotic jumble of fear and morbid curiosity. Is that a villain? Oh my God, the whole street is blocked off. Look at the fire. I hope the heroes get here soon. Quick, get a picture for Herogram. Izuku finally broke through to the front of the police barricade. The scene was worse than he'd imagined. A monstrous creature, seemingly made of viscous, green-brown sludge, had taken over a narrow alleyway connecting two shopping streets. Its body was a churning, amorphous mass, with two huge, maniacal yellow eyes floating in the filth. It had captured someone. A hostage was trapped inside its suffocating form, thrashing wildly, their struggles only causing the sludge to engulf them further. Small, contained explosions erupted from within the villain, setting fire to the surrounding storefronts. Bakugo. The spiky blonde hair, the flashes of his quirk. It was Bakugo. A team of pro-heroes was already on the scene, but they were helpless. Death Arms, his muscles bulging, couldn't get a solid grip on the liquid villain. My punches just go right through him, he yelled in frustration, his thoughts a torrent of angry powerlessness. Kamui Woods was trying to evacuate civilians, his wooden limbs useless against the villain's fluid body and the spreading fires. Damn it, my body is weak to fire. I can't get any closer, Izuku heard his panic thought. Backdraft, the firefighting hero, was working frantically to contain the flames, but the villain's constant explosions were spreading them faster than he could douse them. The psychic atmosphere was thick with the hero's desperation and the growing fear that they were outmatched. He's got a hostage! Someone in the crowd yelled. A junior high school kid, Izuku watched, his blood running cold. His fanboy mind, now supercharged with John's millennia of strategic experience, analyzed the situation with terrifying clarity. He saw every flaw in the hero's approach, every tactical limitation imposed by their quirks. Death Arms relied on brute force against a foe with no solid form. Kamui Woods was neutralized by the environmental hazard. Backdraft was purely defensive. They lacked the versatility, the right combination of quirks, to handle this specific threat. They were waiting for someone with a more suitable power to arrive, but Bakugo didn't have time. Izuku could feel him. Not just see him, but feel him. Through their shared history and his own burgeoning telepathy, he connected with the frantic, terrified mind trapped within the sludge. He felt Bakugo's lungs burning, his desperate fight for air. He felt the sheer, primal terror that lay beneath the layers of arrogance. The boy who was always so powerful, so confident, was drowning, suffocating, and he was terrified of dying. His thoughts were a screaming, incoherent static of pure survival instinct. Can't breathe. Get off me. Don't want to die, not like this. And then, for a split second, Bakugo's thrashing stopped. His eyes, wide and red-rimmed with desperation, locked with Izuku's through the crowd. It was a look Izuku had seen before, in his own reflection. It was the look of the powerless. A silent, desperate plea for help. Something inside Izuku broke. It wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't logic or reason. It was a pure, overwhelming, heroic instinct, a fusion of Izuku Midoriya's lifelong dream and John's ancient duty to protect. His feet were moving before his brain had a chance to object, his legs pumping as he ducked under the police tape and sprinted towards the chaos. Get back here, you idiot! It's too dangerous! Death Arms shouted, but Izuku didn't hear him. The roar of the fire and the scream of Bakugo's thoughts were the only sounds in his universe. He was quirkless. He was a nobody. But he wasn't powerless. Not anymore. He ran straight towards the inferno blocking the alley entrance. The heat was a solid wall, searing his skin. The ingrained, genetic terror of fire, Ramirez's curse, screamed in the back of his mind, a primal Martian instinct to flee. But Izuku's human will, his desperate need to save his friend, his bully, was stronger. Adapt. Overcome. The memory of John whispered. He didn't have time to think. He just needed to get through the fire. He needed to be stronger, tougher. He focused on that single, desperate thought, be strong enough to get through. His body responded. But it wasn't a clean, heroic transformation. His control was non-existent, his knowledge purely theoretical. His body interpreted his desperate plea for strength and durability in the most chaotic, biological way possible. The crowd gasped, their collective thought a wave of shock and horror. Izuku's form twisted and warped as he ran. His skin took on a mottled, greenish-gray hue, hardening into thick, chitinous plates like an insect's carapace. His joints cracked and reformed, his legs elongating, bending at unnatural angles to give him more speed. His arms stretched, his fingers fusing and sharpening into grotesque talons. A ridge of hardened bone erupted along his spine, bursting through the back of his hoodie. He was no longer a boy. He was a nightmare given flesh, a horrifying chimera of human and alien biology. He didn't even realize what he had become. All he knew was that the fire no longer burned his skin. He burst through the wall of flames, a terrifying, multi-jointed creature, and charged directly at the sludge villain. The villain's huge eyes widened in surprise. "What the hell are you?" it gurgled, lashing out with a slimy tendril. Izuku dodged, his new form surprisingly agile. He was at the villain's body now. He could see Bakugo's face, pale and blue-lipped, his struggles growing weaker. He needed to get him out. He couldn't punch the sludge. He couldn't grab it. He needed to get inside. Change your density. Become intangible. Phasing. He'd practiced with his finger. Now he had to do it with his whole body. He focused, pushing past the terrifying sensation of his own atoms losing their cohesion. His monstrous form shimmered, became translucent, and he plunged himself into the villain's disgusting, viscous body. The sensation was vile. It was cold, suffocating, and psychically loud with the villain's simple, malicious thoughts. But he was inside. He could see Bakugo, suspended in the muck. He reached out with his misshapen, terrifying hand to grab the collar of Bakugo's uniform. But his control was slipping. He needed to be solid to grab Bakugo, but intangible to remain inside the villain. He couldn't do both. His hand flickered, phasing in and out of tangibility. Bakugo's eyes widened in terror as a ghostly, freezing cold hand brushed against his neck, then passed right through him, then solidified and gripped his shirt for a bare second before becoming intangible again. "Hold on, Kaken!" Izuku grunted, his voice a distorted, guttural rasp from his changed throat. He was failing. He couldn't get a solid grip. Bakugo was fading. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through his concentration. He needed to get the sludge off him. All of it. Now, another of John S. abilities surfaced in his mind. Not a physical power, but a mental one. Telekinesis. The ability to move objects with the mind. A fundamental Martian skill, as natural to them as breathing. For Izuku, it was a loaded gun he had never even held before. He didn't know how to aim. He didn't know how to regulate the power. He just knew he had to push. He abandoned the phasing, letting his body become fully solid again inside the villain. He focused all his will, all his terror, all his desperate desire to save Bakugo, into a single point in his mind. He pictured the sludge, and with every ounce of his newfound mental strength, he shoved it away. The result was not a gentle separation. It was an explosion. A silent, invisible wave of pure kinetic force erupted from Izuku's position. The sludge villain was blasted apart, not like a liquid, but like a solid object hit by a cannonball. Globs of green-brown filth flew in every direction, splattering against the alley walls with enough force to crack the brickwork. The main body of the villain, containing Bakugo, was flung backwards, slamming into the rear wall before peeling off and collapsing into a stunned, semi-conscious puddle. The telekinetic blast didn't stop there. It continued outwards, a wave of raw, untamed power. The windows of the surrounding shops didn't just crack, they shattered, exploding outwards in a shower of glass. The pavement beneath Izuku's feet buckled and split. The heroes, who had been cautiously approaching the alley, were thrown back as if by a physical blow, skidding across the asphalt. The force was so immense it even kicked up a huge cloud of dust and debris, momentarily obscuring the entire scene. A profound silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the few remaining fires and the distant sound of sirens. As the dust began to settle, the scene was revealed. Bakugo lay on the ground, coughing and gasping for air, but alive. The sludge villain was incapacitated, scattered and semi-solidified across the alley, and in the center of it all stood Izuku. His monstrous, chitinous form slowly began to recede, his body shrinking and softening, melting back into the familiar shape of a 14-year-old boy in a tattered, burned hoodie. He stood there, panting, his body trembling with adrenaline and the sheer exertion of using so much power so chaotically. He had done it. He had saved him. A weak, triumphant smile touched his lips. He looked up, expecting, he wasn't sure what. Cheers? Gratitude? He was met with a wall of stunned, terrified silence. The crowd of onlookers wasn't cheering. They were staring, their mouths agape, their minds a whirlwind of fear and disbelief that crashed against his weakened shields. What was that thing? It wasn't a hero, it was a monster. Did you see what it did to the street? It's more dangerous than the villain. He looked towards the pro-heroes. They weren't rushing to thank him. They were picking themselves up, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and deep, profound wariness. They were looking at him not as a savior, but as a new, unknown threat. Death Arms slowly approached, his stance cautious, his fists clenched. Kid, what are you? The question hit Izuku with the force of a physical blow. He looked down at his own trembling hands, at the destruction around him. The shattered windows, the cracked pavement, the fear in everyone's eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Heroes save people, and everyone smiled. They didn't cause this much damage. They didn't make people look at them with terror. His heart sank like a stone. He hadn't been a hero. He had been a monster who had stumbled into a lucky victory. Then, a new sound cut through the tense silence. A deep, booming laugh that was both familiar and utterly terrifying in this context. Ha ha! Now that was quite the debut. All Might landed on the street with a ground-shaking thud, his signature smile fixed in place, but his eyes were not on the captured villain or the rescued Bakugo. They were locked directly onto Izuku. There was no scolding in his gaze, none of the disappointment Izuku had dreaded his whole life. Instead, there was an intense, piercing curiosity, a look of profound concern and something else. Young man, you have a lot of explaining to do. All Might boomed, taking a step forward. That was the final straw. The fear in the crowd. The suspicion from the heroes. And now, the full, undivided attention of his lifelong idol, the #1 hero in the world. It was too much. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that threatened to crush him. His fight-or-flight instinct screamed at him. And after the fight he just had, all that was left was flight. Vanish. Bend the light. Be unseen. John's knowledge provided the escape route. Izuku panicked. He focused on the idea of not being seen, of simply disappearing. He felt a bizarre, dizzying sensation, as if the world was warping around him, folding like paper. For a split second, the light from the setting sun seemed to bend around his body, creating a shimmering, heat-hazed distortion of the air where he stood. And then, he was gone. To the onlookers, it was as if he had simply popped out of existence. All Might stopped in his tracks, his smile faltering for the briefest of moments. Invisibility, he murmured, his eyes scanning the empty space. Izuku was still there, his heart threatening to burst out of his chest. He could see them all staring at the spot where he had been standing. He was invisible, a ghost in the middle of a disaster he had created. Without a second thought, he turned and ran. He fled the scene, a silent, unseen phantom, leaving behind a saved boy, a captured villain, a street full of destruction, and a world of heroes and civilians with more questions than answers. He ran until his lungs burned and the sounds of the sirens faded behind him. He didn't stop until he was back in the familiar, rusting sanctuary of the Dagobah junk piles. He stumbled, his invisibility flickering out, and collapsed onto the sand. He had saved Kaken. He had acted like a hero. But as he lay there, the horrified faces of the crowd burned into his mind. He had never felt less like one in his entire life. He had power now, more power than he had ever dreamed of. But he was beginning to understand the terrifying truth John had warned him about. Power didn't make a hero. And his first stumbling steps had proven he had no idea how to be one. The weeks that followed the sludge villain incident were a period of self-imposed exile. Izuku became a phantom, a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He attended school, his physical form going through the motions, but his mind was a universe away. He ate dinner with his mother, the taste of her cooking barely registering, his mental shields working overtime to block out her loving, worried thoughts, a necessary cruelty that felt like a betrayal. He was present, but he was not there. His true existence began after the sun went down. Every night, without fail, he would slip out of his house and make the pilgrimage to Dagaho Beach. The mountains of junk, once a symbol of his despair, had transformed into his monastery, his training ground, and his confessional. Here, surrounded by the skeletons of a forgotten world, he could finally begin to explore the echoes of a dead one. He started with the physical. He had to. The chaotic, monstrous transformation during the rescue had terrified him more than the villain itself. He couldn't risk losing control like that again. He needed precision, not just raw, instinctual power. Guided by the vast repository of John's memories, he began a regimen of training that was as mentally taxing as it was physical. He stood before a towering pile of rusted washing machines and focused on a single, simple task, shape-shifting his hand into a perfect replica of John's. He closed his eyes, digging deep into the inherited memories. He didn't just picture the hand. He remembered it. He recalled the feel of its skin, the precise arrangement of its 4 long fingers, the subtle patterns on its green knuckles. His first attempts were grotesque failures. His fingers would elongate but remain too thin, like twigs. The skin would turn green but retain its human texture. Once, his hand morphed into a writhing mass of green tentacles, a subconscious fear manifesting in his flesh. He had to fight waves of nausea, the biological wrongness of it all a visceral protest from his human DNA. Control is not force, John's voice, now a calm and integrated part of his own thoughts, guided him. It is a conversation with your cells. You do not command them. You ask them. Your body is no longer a static object. It is a river. Guide its flow. Izuku took a deep breath, the salty air filling his lungs. He stopped trying to force the change and started to feel it. He extended his consciousness into his own arm, down to the individual cells. He felt their humming potential, the alien blueprint now woven into his very being. He gently suggested the change, nudging his molecules, coaxing them into the new configuration. Slowly, painfully it began to work. Over the course of a week, he learned to form the hand. Then the entire arm. He would spend hours just holding the limb aloft, a perfectly formed green Martian arm attached to a human Japanese boy's shoulder, a bizarre and profound testament to his new nature. He learned to shift its color, from deep forest green to a pale, almost white jade. He practiced forming simple objects, a blade from his forearm, a hammer from his fist, a shield from his palm. Each success was a tiny victory against the chaos that threatened to consume him. He moved on to density shifting. He would stand before a massive, discarded engine block and practice phasing. It was a terrifying leap of faith every time. He had to consciously will his atoms to vibrate at a frequency that would allow them to pass through the space between the atoms of the steel. The first time he managed to push his entire hand through, the sensation of non-existence, the cold static where solid matter should be, was so disorienting he almost threw up. But he persevered. He learned to phase his whole body for a split second, then a full second, then 5. He practiced becoming lighter than air, his feet lifting from the sand in clumsy, uncontrolled hops that were the nascent stages of flight. He practiced becoming denser, rooting himself to the spot, feeling as heavy as a mountain. But the physical training was only a fraction of his nightly education. The true weight of his inheritance was not in his body, but in his mind. When the physical exhaustion became too much, he would find a quiet spot overlooking the dark, churning ocean, and he would let the walls of his mental fortress down, just a little. He would delve into the memories. He didn't just access them like files on a computer. He experienced them. He walked the silent, crystalline streets of a Martian city under the light of its 2 moons, Phobos and Deimos, their names suddenly imbued with a personal, familial meaning. He felt the warmth of a sun that was not his own on skin that was not his own. The Martian society, the green Martian way of life, unfolded before him not as a history lesson, but as a life lived. They were a peaceful, philosophical race, a society of telepaths who had long ago abandoned spoken language for the purity of direct thought. Their concept of self was more fluid, their connection to one another a constant, gentle hum of shared consciousness. There was no true privacy, but there was also no true loneliness. He felt John's life. The joy of bonding with his wife, Myria, a connection so deep it made human concepts of love feel like a pale imitation. He experienced the birth of their daughter, Khm, not just as a witness, but feeling the overwhelming wave of paternal love and protectiveness that was John's. He sat on the porch of their simple, elegant home, watching his daughter play in the red sand, her laughter a pure, clear bell in his mind. These memories were a beautiful, agonizing gift. They filled the hollow spaces in Izuku's lonely heart with a love he had never known, for a family that had been dead for centuries. He would often find himself weeping silently on that dark beach, tears streaming down his face for a wife and child he had never met, yet missed with an ache that felt like it could split his soul in two. And with the beauty came the horror. He learned the truth of Mars's demise. It wasn't a war of ships and weapons, not at first. It was a psychic plague, a great fire of the mind called Ramirez's curse, engineered by their subterranean cousins, the White Martians. The Whites were a race of brutal, shape-shifting warriors who saw the Greens' peaceful philosophy as a weakness to be exploited. They unleashed the curse, a telepathic contagion that turned the Greens' greatest strength, their psychic interconnectedness, into their downfall. It instilled a crippling, psychosomatic fear of fire, for a race that could control their own biology, a belief so strong it became reality. The mere thought of flame would cause their cells to combust, their bodies to dissolve into ash. Izuku experienced the fall of Mars as a waking nightmare. He felt the serene chorus of the Martian collective consciousness twist into a symphony of screaming agony. He saw friends and neighbors burst into flames from a single, terrified, stray thought. He relived John's frantic, desperate attempt to shield his family, to build a mental fortress around them as their world burned. And he felt the ultimate failure. He felt the psychic fire breach his defenses, felt the agony of his wife and daughter as they turned to dust in his arms, their final thought a single, piercing cry of love and terror that was forever burned into his memory. He relived John's escape, the sole survivor, his mind a shattered wasteland of grief, his only companion the raging inferno of his own guilt. He felt the centuries of drifting through the cold, silent void of space, a living tombstone for an entire civilization. He felt the arrival on Earth, the tentative hope, the cautious observation of humanity, a loud, chaotic, vibrant species so full of contradictions. He felt the decision to become a protector, to use his immense power to ensure his adopted world would never suffer the same fate as his first. These memories were a crushing weight. The sheer scale of the grief was enough to break a person, let alone a 14-year-old boy. Some nights, Izuku would just curl up on the sand, overwhelmed, convinced he would drown in the sorrow of a dead man. But John's memories also contained the antidote to his own despair, his discipline. Izuku learned the Martian meditation techniques, the mental katas that had allowed John to endure centuries of solitude without going mad. He learned to compartmentalize the grief, to acknowledge it, honor it, but not let it consume him. He built a memorial for Myria and Khm in a quiet corner of his mind, a place he could visit, a place of love and sorrow that gave his new purpose a profound, personal meaning. He wasn't just training to be a hero, he was honoring the dead. He was ensuring that John's sacrifice, and the sacrifice of his entire race, would not be in vain. One evening, after a particularly grueling session of practicing shape-shifting, he'd finally managed to create a perfect, if temporary, replica of his own face on his hand. He sat down, exhausted, and confronted a new, practical problem. The sludge villain incident had shown him that he couldn't use these powers as Izuku Midoriya. His monstrous, uncontrolled transformation had terrified people. The resulting property damage was immense, and he had become a person of interest, a mystery that both heroes and villains would be desperate to solve. If anyone ever connected that creature to the quirkless kid from Aldera Junior High, his life, and his mother's, would be over. He needed a disguise. A persona. A stable form he could adopt when he went into action. He couldn't risk the chaotic, emotion-fueled transformations anymore. He needed a default hero state. He delved into John's memories again, searching for inspiration. He saw John's classic Martian Manhunter persona. The high collar, the blue cape, the red X harness over a bare green chest. It was iconic, powerful, and profoundly alien. It was a look that screamed, "I am not from here," a fact John had never tried to hide. But Izuku wasn't John. He was a human boy from Muzutafu. He couldn't just copy the form of the man whose soul now resided within him. That felt disrespectful. A cheap imitation. And in a world already wary of the unknown, appearing as a classic, pulp sci-fi alien might not be the best way to win public trust. He needed a fusion, something that honored the legacy but was grounded in his own world. He stood up on a clear patch of sand, the waves lapping gently at the shore. He took a deep breath, reaching into his own mind, into his years of hero analysis. He thought about the core elements of a successful hero costume. It needed to be recognizable. It needed to inspire confidence, not fear. It needed to be practical. He closed his eyes and began the delicate process of the conversation with his cells. He started with John's form as a base, the tall, lean, powerful physique. But he softened the alien sharpness of it. He kept the green skin, that was non-negotiable, a mark of his Martian heritage. But he chose a calmer, more muted shade, like jade or sea glass. He retained the high, regal brow and the lack of hair, a clear nod to his predecessor. For the costume itself, he decided against a bare chest. It felt too strange, too exposed. Instead, he visualized a material forming directly from his own skin, a dark, bioorganic fabric that looked like a modern, tactical hero uniform. He imagined it covering his torso and legs, a deep, midnight blue that was almost black. He kept the iconic red X harness, the metal clasps at his shoulders forming from his own hardened biomass. It was the heart of the Manhunter identity, a symbol he would carry with pride. He visualized the boots, not as separate items, but as his feet themselves, shape-shifted into a durable, dark blue material that was seamlessly integrated with the rest of the uniform. He kept the high collar, but gave it a more modern, structured look. And finally, the cape. John's cape was a symbol of his regal, almost godlike presence. Izuku wanted that, but he wanted it to be his own. He formed a cape of the same midnight blue, but lined it with a deep, heroic red that would flash when he moved. He held the image in his mind clear and precise. He felt his body begin to shift, not with the chaotic violence of before, but with a smooth, controlled fluidity. He grew taller, his muscles defining themselves under the newly formed fabric. His face elongated, his features settling into a noble, calm expression that was a blend of his own youthful face and John's ancient wisdom. When it was done, he slowly opened his eyes. He didn't have a mirror, but he could feel the change. He felt right. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya. He was no longer just a copy of John's. He was something new. He raised the green hand, turning it over in the moonlight. This was his form. This was his mask. Now, he needed a name. Deku was out of the question. That was a name of powerlessness, a brand of mockery he was determined to leave behind. He considered new names, trying them out in his mind. Emerald Knight? The Phantom? Mind Sight? They all felt hollow, generic. A name is a promise, John's voice resonated within him. It is a declaration of who you are and what you stand for. My title was Manhunter. A hunter of those who would harm man. A protector. Izuku looked out at the ocean. John's title was a legacy. A mantle passed down. To reject it would be to reject the gift, to reject the sacrifice that had made this all possible. He was the inheritor of that legacy, whether he wanted it or not. To try and be anything else would be a lie. He was the last son of Mars. He carried the memories, the grief, and the power of the Martian people. It was his burden, and his honor. My name, he said aloud, his voice different in this new form, deeper and more resonant than his own. The sound of it seemed to hang in the salty air, solid and real. My name is Martian Manhunter. He stood there for a long time on the shore of the broken beach, a new hero silhouetted against the moon. He was born of a human boy's dream and a dying god's hope, forged in loneliness and grief. He finally had a face, a form, and a name. He had taken his first real step out of the shadows, but he was blissfully unaware that in the deepest, darkest corners of the world, other shadows were stirring, pale imitations of humanity who carried the memory of an ancient, fiery hatred, and who were hunting for the last echo of a dead world. The hum was the first sign. It was a subtle thing, easily missed by a less attuned mind. For weeks, Izuku had grown accustomed to the background psychic noise of the city. It was a chaotic, organic symphony, a million distinct points of consciousness, each broadcasting its own unique song of thought and emotion. It was messy, vibrant, and alive. This was different. It was a void. A pocket of perfect, unnatural silence in the middle of the psychic orchestra. Izuku first felt it while watching the evening news. He was in his room, half listening to a broadcast while meticulously going over his schoolwork. The television was just background noise, a comforting link to the normal world he was increasingly estranged from. A politician, Kenji Tsurigami, the chief of the Hero Public Safety Commission, was giving a press conference. He was a familiar face, a man known for his sharp suits, sharper rhetoric, and an almost canine-like quirk that gave him the head of a bloodhound. And I assure you, Tsurigami was saying, his voice a flat, even monotone, the Commission is taking every possible measure to analyze the threat posed by the unidentified entity involved in the recent sludge villain incident. Rest assured, your safety is our utmost priority. The words were standard political boilerplate, reassuring and meaningless. But as the camera zoomed in on Tsurigami's face, Izuku felt a psychic chill crawl up his spine, where the man's thoughts should have been. A complex mix of public speaking anxiety, focus on his talking points, perhaps a stray thought about what he was having for dinner. There was nothing. It was a perfectly smooth, polished surface of silence. A black hole in the middle of the psychic spectrum. It wasn't the calm of a trained, meditative mind. Izuku had learned to recognize that in some of the pro-heroes he'd observed. That kind of mental discipline felt like a deep, still pool of water. This was the emptiness of a vacuum. It was the silence of a house where all the furniture has been removed, the walls scrubbed bare, leaving behind only a sterile, soulless echo. Wrong. The single word resonated from the John part of his consciousness, not as a thought, but as a primal, instinctual alarm. This is a shielded mind. A construct. There is nothing behind the curtain. Izuku leaned forward, his pencil dropping from his slack fingers. He stared intently at the screen. Tsurigami's face, despite its canine features, was eerily blank. His eyes, usually sharp and intelligent, were flat, glassy, like the eyes of a doll. He delivered his lines with perfect diction but zero emotional inflection. He wasn't a man giving a speech. He was a machine reciting a script. A cold dread began to pool in Izuku's stomach. This wasn't just a stoic politician. This was something fundamentally inhuman trying, and failing, to wear a human suit. The memory, ancient and full of fire, surfaced unbidden. A white Martian, disguised as a green Martian philosopher, standing before the High Council, its mind a perfect, placid surface hiding the screaming abyss of hatred within. It was their greatest trick, their most terrifying weapon, the ability to not just mimic a form, but to project a psychic blankness that could fool even other telepaths, unless you knew what to listen for. The silence was their signature. The press conference ended. Izuku sat there, his heart pounding, the room suddenly feeling too small, too cold. He looked around at his All Might posters, his hero notebooks, the relics of a simpler, more innocent life. That life was over. The fight John had warned him about, the reason he had died, wasn't a future threat. It wasn't coming. It was already here. Sleep offered no escape that night. His dreams were haunted by white, monstrous figures with burning red eyes, their forms shifting like smoke, their minds a silent, screaming void. He saw them wearing the faces of his mother, of All Might, of Bakugo, their familiar features stretched over an inner emptiness that was more terrifying than any monster. He woke up in a cold sweat, the psychic silence of Kenji Tsurigami echoing in his mind. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't go to the police or the heroes. What could he say? The chief of the HPSC feels weird in my brain? They would think he was a lunatic, or a villain trying to sow discord. He was alone with this knowledge. He was the only one who could see the puppets. He had to be sure. The next day after school, he didn't go to the beach. His path had a new, terrifying purpose. He took a series of trains to the government district, a sterile landscape of towering steel and glass buildings. The headquarters of the Hero Public Safety Commission was a fortress of mirrored windows and imposing architecture, a symbol of order and control. He found a secluded alleyway across the street, the late afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows. The psychic hum of this district was different from his neighborhood. It was less emotional, more focused. A constant thrum of ambition, stress, bureaucracy, and secrets. But it was still fundamentally human. He waited. He knew from John S. memories that this was the part of heroism that wasn't shown on TV, the long, boring, patient hours of surveillance. He closed his eyes, filtering out the surrounding thoughts, focusing his telepathic senses on the entrance of the HPSC building. He was searching for that specific, unnatural blankness. For hours he listened. He felt the minds of hundreds of workers as they left for the day, a young intern worrying about a report, a seasoned bureaucrat thinking about his daughter's piano recital, a security guard mentally complaining about his sore feet. All normal. All human. Then, as dusk began to bleed into the sky, he felt it. A wave of psychic silence washed out of the building's main doors. It was like a perfectly soundproofed car driving through a noisy street. First one, then another, then a third. 3 figures in dark suits emerged, flanking the real Kenji Tsurigami. They moved with a synchronized, fluid grace that was just a little too perfect, their faces impassive masks. And their minds? Absolute voids. But the real Tsurigami was the epicenter. The blankness around him was even more profound than it had been on television. He walked stiffly, his head held at a rigid angle, his movements lacking the natural, subtle shifts of a living being. He was a marionette, and Izuku could almost feel the psychic strings. They are his handlers, John's voice supplied, cold and analytical. The real Tsurigami is likely dead. This is a replacement. The others are its guards, its chorus. They reinforce each other's psychic shields. A standard white Martian infiltration cell. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. Dead. A man with a family, a life, a history erased and replaced by a pale imitation. The sheer, cold-blooded audacity of it was staggering. This wasn't a simple smash-and-grab villainy. This was a silent invasion. A war fought in the shadows with stolen faces and empty minds. He had to follow them. He had to know more. He drew upon his training. He pictured his new heroic form, the Martian Manhunter, but this time he didn't manifest it physically. He just needed the powers. He focused on the memory of John becoming unseen, not by ceasing to exist, but by bending light. He willed the photons around him to curve, to flow around his body like water around a stone. The world shimmered for a moment, the alley walls distorting as if seen through a heat haze. Then, he was invisible. Next, intangibility. He let his atoms vibrate, phasing just enough to muffle the sound of his footsteps, to become a ghost moving through the world. He slipped out of the alley and followed the silent quartet from a safe distance. They moved with unnerving purpose, ignoring the bustling crowds around them, who in turn seemed to unconsciously give them a wide berth, sensing some primal wrongness they couldn't name. They didn't get into a car. They walked, their path taking them away from the main thoroughfares, into a district of older, abandoned warehouses and forgotten industrial buildings. The psychic noise of the city faded, leaving Izuku alone with the 4 gaping voids ahead of him. The silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against his ears. They stopped before a large, derelict warehouse, its windows boarded up, its metal doors rusted shut. One of the suited figures, a blank, placed a hand on the massive lock. There was no click, no sound of tumblers. The metal of the lock seemed to soften, to flow like liquid mercury for a moment, before reforming in the unlocked position. White Martian molecular control, another confirmation. They slipped inside, the heavy door groaning shut behind them, plunging the area into near silence. Izuku waited, his invisible form pressed against the cold brick of a neighboring building. His mind was a battlefield. The Izuku part, the scared 14-year-old, was screaming at him to run, to get away, to call all might, to do anything but go into that dark, terrifying building. But the John part, the ancient warrior, the last survivor of a genocide, was cold with a righteous fury. This was why he existed. This was the enemy. To retreat was to dishonor the dead. To run was to condemn his new home to the same fate as his old one. He had to go in. He had to know their plan. He took a deep breath, solidified his resolve, and phased directly through the brick wall of the warehouse. The transition was jarring. He passed from the cool night air into a vast, dark, and cold interior. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else, a faint, sharp, ozonic tang, like the inside of John's crashed pod. The warehouse was a cavernous space. Moonlight lanced through cracks in the high ceiling, illuminating a scene that would be forever burned into Izuku's memory. The center of the warehouse floor was dominated by a large, circular pit, glowing with a soft, pulsating, pale green light. Strange, non-Euclidean alien technology, all sharp angles and sickly curves, was arranged around it. It looked like a cross between a laboratory and a temple. The 4 figures stood at the edge of the pit. As Izuku watched, their forms began to shimmer and melt. The crisp suits and human features dissolved like wax, the Tsurigami imposter's canine head receding into a featureless lump. Their bodies elongated, their limbs stretching into impossibly long, thin appendages. Their skin bleached to a bone white, and their skulls reshaped, the flesh pulling back to reveal large, black, insectoid eyes and gaping, needle-toothed maws. They were no longer human imitations. They were white Martians in their true, terrifying forms. They communicated not with sound, but with flashes of raw, telepathic data, a language of pure, predatory intent that Izuku could now intercept. It wasn't like human thought. It was cold, efficient, and utterly without empathy. Status report, Phase 1 complete, projected the one that had been Tsurigami. It seemed to be the leader. The commission is now under our control. The asset is pliable. Access to hero deployment schedules, personnel files, and emergency protocols is secured. Public suspicion is minimal, another projected. The entity from the sludge incident has created a useful distraction. The humans are focused on the emergence of a new, powerful unknown. They are looking for monsters in the light, while we grow in the dark. The birthing matrix is stable, the third reported, gesturing with a long, white talon towards the glowing pit. We can begin replication of other key assets. The Minister of Defense is next on the target list, then the director of UA High School. Izuku's blood ran cold. This wasn't just one cell. This was the beachhead of a full-scale invasion. They were systematically replacing the pillars of their society's defense from the top down. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the heroes would be taking orders from their worst enemies. It was a strategy of chilling, brilliant patience. He had to get out. He had to take this information to someone, to All Might. This was too big for him to handle alone. He began to back away, moving with the silent, ghostly grace of an intangible spirit. But his mind, reeling from the revelations, was a chaotic storm of horror and fear. His control over his psychic shields, the fortress he had so carefully constructed, wavered for a barest fraction of a second. It was like a single drop of blood in a tank full of sharks. The leader's monstrous head snapped up, its black eyes fixing on the exact spot where Izuku was standing. Intruder! It shrieked telepathically, the mental command a spike of pure agony in Izuku's brain. A mind is present. A green! The psychic shriek was so powerful it shattered Izuku's concentration. His invisibility failed, his form flickering back into existence for a split second, not as a Japanese schoolboy, but as the tall, green-skinned Martian Manhunter persona he had designed on the beach. He had been so focused on stealth that his mind had defaulted to his combat state. For a heartbeat, the two ancient enemies stared at each other across the cavernous warehouse. The last son of a dead world and the vanguard of its destroyers. Then, all hell broke loose. The 4 white Martians moved with a speed that was utterly inhuman. They didn't run, they flowed across the floor, their white forms blurring into streaks of motion. Izuku reacted on pure instinct. The John part of him, the warrior, took over. He became denser, rooting himself to the floor as the first Martian slammed into him, its sharpened talons screeching against his bio-armored chest. The impact was like being hit by a truck, but he held his ground. You are a child playing with a dead man's power. The leader hissed in his mind. We devoured your world. We will devour this one too. Another white Martian's arm elongated, turning into a wicked, bone-white scythe, and swung at Izuku's head. He phased, the blade passing harmlessly through his neck. He solidified and lashed out with a telekinetic shove, sending the creature tumbling back. But they were relentless. They were born warriors, their bodies weapons, their minds honed for conquest. One of them shape-shifted, its form swelling, its skin turning a rocky gray, mimicking the quirk of a pro-hero it must have observed. It charged him, a brute force battering ram. Izuku was forced to give ground, retreating into the maze of machinery around the pit. He was outmatched. Not in raw power. He could feel the ocean of John's potential within him, but in experience. They fought as a coordinated unit, their silent telepathic communication giving them perfect battlefield awareness. He was one boy, fighting a forefront war. He dodged another attack, phasing through a piece of alien machinery. The white that had mimicked Tsurigami was on him instantly, its hands plunging into the machine after him. But instead of trying to grab him, its hands began to glow with a malevolent energy. A trap! Izuku realized too late. The machine overloaded, erupting in a massive explosion of green light and alien energy. The blast threw Izuku clear across the warehouse. He slammed into the far wall, his intangible state failing on impact. The concrete cracked behind him, and he fell to the floor, his head ringing, his vision swimming. He had made a critical error. He, a boy who had studied pro-heroes his whole life, had forgotten the most basic rule of combat: know your enemy. John's memories contained a universe of knowledge about the whites, but in his panic, Izuku hadn't accessed it. He was fighting like a human with new powers, not like a Martian. He struggled to his feet, his body aching. The 4 white Martians advanced on him, their forms shifting, melting into nightmarish combinations of claws, blades, and teeth. They were savoring this, enjoying the hunt. You carry the stench of Johns, the leader projected, its voice dripping with ancient hatred. The last, pathetic relic of a failed race. We will take his power from your corpse and add it to our own. You will tell us everything you know before we peel your mind apart, layer by layer. They were cornering him. There was no escape. His fear was a cold, hard knot in his chest. The boy in him wanted to curl up and cry. But as they closed in, something else rose to meet the fear. It was the grief. The burning, bottomless grief for a wife and child he'd never met. The image of Mars burning, the faces of the white Martians, illuminated by the psychic flames that had consumed his people. This wasn't just a fight for his life. This was vengeance. Stop thinking like a boy, he told himself, John's discipline and his own desperate will fusing into a single, cold point of clarity. Start fighting like a Martian. He pushed the fear down, replacing it with cold fury. He let John's instincts flow. He stopped seeing with just his eyes and opened his other senses. He felt the subtle shifts in air pressure as they moved. He saw their heat signatures, burning cold against the ambient temperature. He felt the vibrations of their steps through the concrete floor. The rocky one charged again. This time, Izuku didn't just dodge. He shape-shifted. His own arms flowed and merged, forming a single, massive, green shield, impossibly dense. The white Martian crashed against it with a sickening crunch of breaking bone. Before it could recover, Izuku's other arm snaked out, elongating into a whip-like tendril, and cracked across the face of the scythe wielder. At the same time, a new pair of arms erupted from his back, a tactic of bioduplication John had used 1,000 times, and they fired off tight, focused beams of red energy from his eyes, Martian vision. The beams weren't designed to be lethal, but they struck the 4th Martian with concussive force, sending it flying. He was fighting on their level now. A whirlwind of shifting forms and protean fury. He focused on the leader. It was the nexus of their cell. Take it out, and the others might fall into disarray. He phased through the floor, a disorienting tactic, and erupted behind the leader. His hands morphed into massive, sledgehammer-like fists. But the leader was old and cunning. It anticipated the move, its own body becoming intangible a split second before Izuku's fists would have connected. It spun around, its black eyes burning with cold intelligence. Clever, little ghost. But you are still just an echo. Its hand shot out and grabbed Izuku's arm. But it wasn't a physical grip. Its white flesh seemed to merge with his green skin, and a wave of pure psychic poison flooded into Izuku's mind. It wasn't an attack of force. It was an attack of identity. It tried to pry apart the fusion of Izuku and John, to exploit the seams, to turn the boy's fear against the Martian's grief. Images flooded his mind, his mother's terrified face, Bakugo's sneer, his own quirkless diagnosis, all twisted into weapons of self-doubt. You're a fake. A monster. You're not a hero. You're just a scared little boy in a dead man's skin. Izuku screamed in his own mind, the pain of the psychic assault 1,000 times worse than any physical blow. His control was slipping, his form flickering between human and Martian, but in that agony, he found an anchor. The memory of John's final moments. The feeling of his pure, heroic heart. The final, desperate hope he had placed in a quirkless boy on a junk-filled beach. Be the best of us. Izuku roared, a telepathic blast of pure, unadulterated will. He didn't fight the psychic poison with logic or strength. He fought it with emotion. He pushed back not with John's grief, but with his own. His 14 years of pain, of frustration, of being told he was worthless, of dreaming a dream that was impossible. He weaponized his own humanity. He flooded the leader's mind with the chaotic, messy, powerful emotions the white Martians had long ago abandoned. The leader shrieked, recoiling as if burned. The raw, unfiltered empathy and hope were anathema to its cold, predatory consciousness. In that moment of weakness, Izuku acted. He knew he couldn't win. He couldn't defeat all of them and escape. But he could send a message. He could unmask them. He poured every remaining ounce of his strength into one final, desperate telepathic assault, not on the leader's mind, but on its control over its own body. He wasn't trying to injure it. He was trying to force a transformation. The leader's body convulsed. Its psychic shields, weakened by Izuku's emotional counterattack, shattered. The carefully controlled form it wore began to bubble and warp. With a final, agonizing push, Izuku forced it into its true, horrifying shape. Then he fled. He turned intangible, invisible, and poured all his energy into speed. He flew, not with grace, but with raw, panicked propulsion, straight up through the roof of the warehouse and into the night sky, the telepathic screams of the enraged white Martians chasing after him. He didn't stop until the city was a glittering tapestry below him, his lungs burning, his mind a wasteland of pain and exhaustion. He had survived. He had confirmed the threat. But he had also announced his presence. The silent war was no longer secret. The pale impostors knew he was here. They knew that the legacy of Mars lived on, and now, the hunt was truly on.